It has been more than 150 years now since the great wagon trains headed west out of Missouri, hundreds deep and sometimes over a mile wide, carrying eager young immigrants to a new life in the American West. Theirs was a journey that, by today's standards, can hardly be imagined. The wonder is that anyone took to the trail at all. In the 1830s, the western half of North America was remote, dangerous, and largely unexplored. Those who made their way into this vast wasteland did so against the advice of almost everyone. To a sane person at the time, the journey was considered sheer foolishness. The distance alone was mind-boggling. Between Missouri and the Pacific Ocean, there were 2,000 miles of uncharted wilderness.
As far as the Oregon Territory, of course, at that point it was still actually owned and controlled by the British, but there was the opportunity for settlement out there. The British weren't too concerned about American influence, primarily because nobody thought that there was a possibility of Americans being able to make that kind of a trip for 2,000 miles over barren wilderness.
At the time, few people had even attempted to cross the continent. There were no roads and few trails, and no wagon had ever been driven across this great American desert. Could a wagon train even make the trip? And if so, what route was the best? Could food be gotten along the way? Could the farm equipment immigrants would need in Oregon be carried with them? And most importantly, could women and children make the journey? In 1836, a missionary named Marcus Whitman was one of the first white men to actually lead a wagon train to Oregon. In the spring of that year, he took his wife, 2 wagons, and a small party west to establish a mission in Oregon Territory. In 10 months, they reached the Columbia River, marking a trail and proving that what was once considered sheer foolishness was now a practical fact. Families could cross from Missouri to the Pacific Ocean by wagon for the cost of a few $100s. By the 1840s, word had spread throughout the East. It would be America's manifest destiny to settle the West. Free land and the promise of a better life awaited anyone willing to endure the Oregon Trail.
The fact that these people who were the immigrants went ahead and did it on their own, they in effect made the decision regardless what the United States government was going to do, profoundly changed our history and the world's history.
The people that tended to make the migration, we've been determining more and more, were not necessarily your wealthy, established families from old East Coast states. They tended to be of more moderate means, obviously very adventuresome, but seeking something more than what they were able to have in their home communities.
We think of them as pioneers. They were farmers. They were people who didn't even know how to drive a team of oxen when they started out. They were people pretty much unused to using weapons. In fact, they killed themselves a lot more than they ever killed anyone else.
But the flood of immigrants was slow to begin. In 1840, only 13 intrepid pioneers made it across to the Willamette Valley. In 1841, 58 more headed down the Oregon Trail. A year later, 125 followed. But in 1843, things began to change.
There got to be more and more population back east. The prices of land went up, and so it was an opportunity to come west for a start if you were of somewhat humble means.
John Mark Lambertson is a historian here at the National Trail Center in Independence, Missouri. He says the immigrants had already made an arduous trek to Missouri by the time they joined other overlanders gathering here in the spring of 1843.
Because it was an expensive venture to make the trip, to be able to purchase the wagon and enough oxen to pull it and all the harness and to be outfitted with all the foodstuffs for that many months of a trip. and of hopefully having enough money to be able to establish yourself once you got to your new location for a home.
You had to have money to go west. Most of these people were people who sold farms that they already had on the frontier and throughout the United States. They invested all of the cash from those farms in making this trip, and they had to be capable of supporting themselves for a while before they could become productive again.
William C. Bullard is an author familiar with the Great Migration.
When you got to independence, it was the last point on the frontier. Once you left here, you were out in the territories, and you were facing what they then called the Great American Desert.
The outfitters of Independence and nearby Westport had never seen such a crowd of movers as poured through their muddy streets that spring. For 20 years, commercial freight wagons had ventured down the Santa Fe Trail to trade in the West. But this year, the group was different. They were mostly families. There were close to 1,000 of them, and they were planning to go all the way to Oregon. Most of them had no idea of the dangers that awaited them along the trail. They would have to cross 3 treacherous mountain ranges, ford several wild rivers, contend with the relentless dust, and worst of all, disease. These movers were farm families who had been hit hard by the economic crash of 1837 and the deep depression that followed. It was a time when the Industrial Revolution was encroaching upon farmland. Factories were paying low wages, taxes were high, the air was filthy, and the water polluted. For many, joining a wagon train destined for Oregon offered the hope of a better life. So in the spring of 1843, the great human migration began. Today, 150 years later, modern-day movers are gathering at the National Trail Center in Independence to celebrate this great migration.
Oh God, our Father, as you sit on high and look down on us poor mortals, forgive our trespasses.
The weather was much the same in late April 1843 when thousands of the original overlanders began converging on Independence, all eager to sign on with a wagon train and get their journey underway. They knew time was of the essence. They had to make Oregon before the winter snows choked off access to the Willamette Valley. In 1843, the grass necessary to support livestock was slow in coming, and families were growing nervous as they waited inside soggy tents, hoping for the rains to end. Finally, when the grass reached 6 inches, the decision was made to start. On May 22nd, a huge caravan assembled a few miles outside Independence, and the great journey began. The departure was a wild one. As fast as anxious travelers hitched their wagons and headed off, others rushed ahead of them for the lead spots. There were quarrels, fist fights, and chaos. Peter Burnett, a mover destined to become California's first governor. A family who could afford to would take 2 or 3 wagons on the trip, and most preferred to build their own to ensure that they were strong enough to make the journey.
And the people that would work on the wagon would work for passage instead of pay to go across to Oregon to follow their dream too. I think as they were signing on, they would ask them about their skills. Could they hunt? Were they a blacksmith? Had they built wagons? Were they good stock drovers, etc.? And the people would kind of sort themselves out. And it was pretty obvious to the trail captains, the people that had the ability to do the different chores.
And again, the Hollywood picture is Daddy riding on the fine white horse and Mama and the children sitting in the wagon. These wagons were about 4.5 feet wide and about 14 feet long. They were very lightly built because of the passage across the mountains. They carried a couple thousand pounds only, and what they carried had to be packed into those wagons clear up to the hooks that held the canvas across the top.
The canvas was tall enough so that a person could stand inside. Nobody slept inside the wagon, but belongings were packed on either side of a center aisle, kept clear for carrying the sick or injured. Generally, a fully loaded wagon could weigh as much as 7,000 pounds and would take a team of up to 12 horses to drag it across the plains. No wonder immigrant families started discarding their heavier belongings soon after leaving civilization.
So much of the decision-making as far as the packing, of course, had to be made back in their original home place of Illinois or Ohio or wherever they came from. And that was, a lot of that was the woman's role as far as having to decide what of all these things she had in her household that she was having to leave behind with other family members or sell. And I think a lot of that was pretty heartbreaking. They were already being uprooted from familiar environment, landscape, home, family, but to having to leave most of your personal possessions behind was an additional blow to that. So they were taking a few prized mementos and then basic necessities. There was a great deal of weaving that went into the process before being ready so that you had enough material goods along for whether it was for making coats or underwear or anything else, so that you had that clothing supply. The rest of it was largely very utilitarian things as far as foodstuffs, cooking pans, things of that nature.
Actually, oxen were cheaper than horses or mules, so a lot of them literally bought the oxen because they were cheaper, and also they could walk beside the oxen. They couldn't keep up with the horses as easily or keep up with the mules.
Almost every immigrant crossed the continent on foot. Small children and grandparents alike trudged beside their wagons at a rate of 1 mile an hour, making perhaps 16 miles a day on a good day.
These people were also taking with them spare oxen or mules. They were taking riding horses. They were taking cattle. A great many of them were taking hogs.
During their first days on the trail, the overlanders experienced something new all the time. They had never seen a western sunset, a prairie thunderstorm, or a real mountain, not to mention Indians. But after the first week or so, a certain routine set in and their journey became routine. Days on the trail began early. At 4 o'clock, gunshots from the sentries woke the camp. While the women had prepared breakfast, the men saddled the horses, harnessed the animals, and readied the wagons. After breakfast, the sleeping tents came down, dishes were scoured, packed, and the train was moving before sunrise. As the wagons moved west, hunters rode off to find game. Several others went ahead with picks and shovels to smooth out a path for the wagons, which seldom, if ever, stayed in a straight line as they drove west.
There was a lot of dust out on the trail, and to go in single file in that, you were really choking at the back. They tended to spread out more for air, not only with the wagons, but of course you had all these ranging cattle and horses and even sheep that would be taken along. So the wagon trains tended to be spread out much wider than what we think in terms of. That's also reflected in some of the ruts that are still visible, in that you have whole series of ruts or swales, we call them,